Hello, this is David Heine, and we're here today at the Nederlands Sheepvaart Museum. And we're going to talk with Joost Strochenbroek about the new exhibit, Rich Cargo's Dutch Prosperity, which just recently opened. It's the second part of a two-part exhibit. The first part now has gone to Groningen. And, well, first of all, Joost, I would like to ask you about the museum itself, the Sheepvaart Museum. Could you please tell us a little of the history of the building?
Yes, originally the building was built in 1656 during a period of 9 months, which is quite amazing when you realize that this huge yellow brick building quite close to Central Station was built in such a short period of time. And originally it was built for the Admiralty of Amsterdam, one of the more important admiralties at the time. There were 5 in those days, and the one in Amsterdam was the largest and the wealthiest, I guess you can say. So originally the building was built as an arsenal where all the commodities and goods that you need to equip a man of war were located. So think of rope and tar and cannonballs and guns and cannons and all that, and it was all installed in this building. On the other hand, there was also a specific room, and this room is still here at this day, where famous naval heroes like Michiel Adriaan Zoon de Ruyter and Cornelis Tromp came in, and they received their orders from the Board of Admiralty, the Admiralty Board, to go to the Mediterranean, to fight the pirates in the Channel, occasionally go to the Perfide Albion to fight the British over there, and certainly, and that's of course important for our specific project here, also to receive orders to fight the Swedes quite often and part with the Danes.
Now, the collection that has been amassed in these buildings, could you tell me about this, how it was assembled?
Yes, the earliest collections date from, say, the 1920s. That is when they were collected and brought over to not so much this building, but to another building in the center of town. This building here, where we are now nowadays, the Nederlands Scheepvaart Museum, this building This building houses the museum from the 1970s onwards. And before that time we were housed in a smaller building in the center of town. The collections were brought together by famous harbor barons, I guess you can say. In those days, in the 1920s, Amsterdam still had harbor barons. Nowadays you might think that they all moved to Rotterdam and get money and get wealthy over there. But in the 1920s they were here, and they had huge collections of globes and charts and maps and paintings and ship models especially too. So all these people came together in 1922 and thought to themselves and to each other, well, we have all these rich collections. There is a necessity to start a maritime museum, a national maritime museum, or certainly a maritime museum with a national outlook, so to speak. So why don't we bring all these collections together and start from there? So from the 1920s onwards until nowadays, this collection has been expanded gradually, or very rapidly in certain years too.
And the collection itself is made up of, as you say, models, but there's an enormous number of wonderful maritime paintings here. Is this all part of that effort to collect it?
It certainly is. Some of our beautiful paintings have been acquired quite recently, but I guess you know as well as I do that specifically for large paintings, and especially also large paintings of high quality, you nowadays may have to pay a fortune. And we do not have a budget that makes it possible for us to acquire huge paintings of millions and millions of guilders. So the major part of our huge painting collection indeed was brought together in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, certainly the years before the Second World War. Then it was still possible to acquire paintings for, I guess, a reasonable sum, even to nowadays standards.
You also have a model of a boat out here in the harbor. Could you describe that and how that came about?
Yes, you of course mean the reconstruction of the Amsterdam, the VOC ship, the Dutch East Indiaman Amsterdam. That the original one was built in 1748, in 3 or 4 months' time, it was an absolute record here in the Netherlands, quite close by actually, just a few hundred meters away from where we are nowadays and today. This ship was built, but unfortunately, on its maiden voyage in January 1749, it ran aground quite close to Hastings in a storm, in a heavy storm, and eventually got shipwrecked. And the wreck is still there. And at low tide, you can see the ship coming up to the surface, so to speak. And that was an important thing. Of course, it was a dramatic thing in those days, but an important thing nowadays for our geologists and also for historians to see this ship coming up and giving us information, providing information on how it was built, how many people were there on board, what did it look like, what kind of wood was used, all those magnificent and very important details that were given to us. Several years ago, in the beginning of the 1980s, people combined all this information and thought to themselves, well, wouldn't it be wonderful to try to rebuild this Amsterdam? And the result is here nowadays. You can still see it. So it's a reconstruction of an 18th century Dutch East Indiaman, as opposed to the Batavia, which is a reconstruction of a 17th century Dutch East Indiaman. And people will certainly see the huge differences between the two.
Now, from time to time, the museum here has special shows. You have several right now that are on. Would you describe the particular one we're talking about, the Baltic Trade Show, and how that came about?
Yes, I certainly would like to do that, because I think this is also a good opportunity to indicate that one of the reasons why we decided to focus on the Netherlands and the Baltic trade is that too many people, in our beliefs, do still think that the Dutch East India Company stood at the cradle of the Golden Age in the Netherlands. It certainly was one of the participants of other people, a group of people that stood on the cradle, at the cradle of the Golden Age. But before that time, way before the VOC was originated in 1602, the trade with the Baltic was already of a huge importance. Hundreds and hundreds of ships on a yearly basis went from the Netherlands to the Baltic area. From the 13th century onwards, originally in Hanseatic, within the Hanseatic League, certain cities in the Netherlands were member of this Hanseatic League, and within this league they participated and tried to maintain a monopoly in the Baltic trade. Eventually, during the 16th century especially, the demand for the commodities that came from the Baltic to Europe was so huge, especially the demand for grain, especially the demand for grain from the Mediterranean area, from Italy and Spain, was so huge that the Hanseatic League did not maintain its monopoly. It wasn't possible for the Hanseatic League to provide the ships, to provide the storage area, so to speak, to provide all this grain that people needed. And at that specific moment, say in the middle of the 16th century, around 1550, Hollanders, people from the province of Holland, jumped in and thought, okay, well, this is our chance. We have to beat this Hanseatic League. And we send the ships and we make sure that people in the Mediterranean area will get their grain. Of course, not for nothing. They have to pay for it quite heavily.
And did they have special kinds of ships that they did this in?
During the 16th century, the Hollanders still used the same kind of ships as the Hanseatic partners or cities did. From the 1595 or around 1600 onwards, the so-called fluit or fluitschip was developed, which I think is quite an interesting symbol of Dutch pragmatism and opportunism. When skippers traveled from the Netherlands to the Baltic area, they had to go through the Øresund, the sound, the small sea lane between the tiny sea lane between Sweden and Denmark. At the entrance of the sea lane, or if you will, at the exit of the sea lane, depending on from what side you leave the Baltic or enter the Baltic, there's the castle of Kronborg. And in Kronborg, people had to pay taxes to be able to pass the Øresund on their way to the Baltic area. This tax was based, among other things, on the width of the upper deck of a ship. So that explains why the fluitschip that came into being in those days has this very narrow compared to its hull, a very narrow upper deck and a huge, well, bulgy and bulky outlook under the water area. So if you could compare it, to a pear, I guess, a pear-shaped ship that was used. And that's one of the explanations why they used these kind of ships. And of course the taxes were low, but they were able to put in a lot of products, commodities, and ship them from the Baltic to other parts of Europe. Not only in the Netherlands. Only a small part, relatively speaking, of what they traded stayed in the Netherlands, and the major part was distributed over the rest of Europe. So I guess you can say they were the merchantmen, the traders of Europe in those days.
Now, we talked a little earlier, and we did a show at the Nieuwkerk about the Spanish Empire of approximately the same period of time. Was the Spanish Empire then one of the customers?
It certainly was one of the countries that provided commodities for the Dutch to ship to the Baltic. So in that sense, yes, Spanish wine or Portuguese wine, French wine was all transported from the Netherlands. Of course, they first went to the Iberian Peninsula, put in the commodities and brought them over to the Baltic. But also the other way around, it certainly works that way. That a lot of the grain, but also the timber, the wood, was transported to Spain. You may know of the story of the Spanish Armada of 1588. So many ships were built in those days that the major part of the woods, the forests in Spain, were destroyed, were destructed, because all the timber went into these floating castles. So people in Spain, for their shipbuilding activities, also needed the wood that was transported from the Baltic by the Dutch. So I guess in a sense you can say that the Dutch may have contributed to prolonging the 80 Years' War, the Dutch Revolt, by providing the wood so the Spanish could build the ships to fight the Dutch. It's a rather complicated story, but I guess that's sort of true in a sense.
Now, in this exhibit that you have now mounted here, what are the component parts and what are you explaining to the public?
The major theme that we try to put forward is that indeed the Dutch trade with the Baltic has been of such huge importance. Why? Because so many ships, so many people were involved in this trade for so many years, for hundreds and hundreds of years, for centuries. And why do we think did this hardly get any attention, certainly as far as exhibits is concerned? Because it's a trade in crude material. It's grain, it's timber, it's tar, it's saltpeter, it's stockfish, dried fish. It's not very exotic, is it? When you talk about the Dutch East India Company and you think about the porcelain or the tea or the spices or the beautiful textiles, it's gold, silver, it's a completely different story. It's exotic, it's beautiful. So that's why we try to put forward in our exhibit the magnificent encompassing importance of the Baltic trade, the commodities that were transported, the people that were involved, the ships that were involved, but also not so much what we also try to do in our exhibit is not only focus on the trade, also on warfare. You can't carry on trade without protection. And who protected the merchantmen? The men of war. Many of the naval heroes that received their orders in this building were involved in protecting this trade with the Baltic. And occasionally you find in sources 150 or 200 ships waiting on the roadstead of Texel to be convoyed, to be protected and have escort to the Baltic area, which is an amazing figure. 200 ships, 10, 15, maybe 20 people on board each ship, 4,000 people waiting to be transported there and start the trade. So you have Mars, the god of war, you have Mercury, the god of the merchandise, of trade, but in their wake came the muses, the culture. Think about the Dutch architects that went over to Danzig and to other places and certainly shaped the towns according to their ideas and views. Think about the painters and engravers that came over from Denmark to our country, but also went from the Netherlands to the Baltic area. So there certainly is a cultural influence on both sides. So that's what we try to focus on in our exhibit too. And last but not least, the souvenirs that were brought back by Dutch sailors from the Baltic area, which I guess in a sense is also some sort of a cultural phenomenon, but say then culture with a small c instead of a big C.
And what exactly would they bring back?
These Dutch sailors would specifically bring back what was very popular in those days was the so-called Riga hout, Riga wood, which merely refers to the way this wood was decorated with gold and beautiful dark red symbols. Although the wood itself came from Russia, so it's a little tricky to call it Riga wood, indicating that it should come from Riga, but the wood came from Russia. So that was quite popular. All baskets and vases, tobacco boxes, all decorated with all these different symbols. A specific kind of souvenir, I guess you can call it, is the so-called Baltic spoon. During specifically the 19th century, skippers from Groningen and Friesland who took over the hegemony, the supremacy from the Hollanders in those days, they traded with all kind of agents in Koningsberg, so nowadays called Kaliningrad, Danzig, nowadays of course Gdansk, and other places in the Baltic area. And once the negotiations had stopped and a deal was done, these skippers would receive a so-called Baltic spoon, a silver spoon indicating with the year, with the name of the agent and the place that the deal was done. This was a souvenir that they did not have to pay for themselves. I guess the owner of the ship did it in a sense. But it was a wonderful souvenir for these people to realize, oh yeah, 10 years ago I did business with these and these people. Let's try to call them again and see what kind of business we could do.
So, speaking of the crew and on these Flauten ships, what was a typical trip like for this group, and how often did they go in a year?
During the 17th and 18th century, indeed, especially the fluitschip was still of importance. Later on, smaller ships were developed with a flatter keel, so to speak, so these ships could also not only stay close to the coast of these countries, but also go on the inland waterways and get the commodities themselves, instead of relying upon other people bringing the commodities to the harbors. So there was quite an important development that you can see there too eventually. A crew normally consists of some 10-15 persons. These ships were out for 8 weeks in total. Say from leaving the Netherlands, waiting on the roadside of Texel, going to the Baltic, do that trade and come back again. It took more than 8 weeks. So you can imagine, and you may imagine, and indeed it was true too, that many skippers made more than one trip to the Baltic per year. There were skippers that made 3 or 4 trips to the Baltic. So when you look at the numbers of passages through the Øresund, I guess you still have to sort of divide this number by 3 or by 2, because these numbers are consist of outward going voyages, homeward going voyages, and also they indicate that some skippers were 2 or 3 times per year on their way to the Baltic. Nevertheless, when you look at the figures, you can say that, for instance, for the period that you just referred to, the period 1580, 1640, 1580, 1680, around that time, some 60% of all the ships going through the Sund were Dutch, had the Dutch flag, and you talk about some 3,000 to 3,500 passages. So still, say, 800 to 1,000 ships being involved in this trade. It was quite an interesting thing to find in archives a certain letter written by a sailor in the middle of the 19th century, so a little later, more recent. A certain person called Gerrit Bakker. Was a young lad who went to the Baltic and was mustered on one of the ships. He arrived in Riga eventually, and he thought to himself, well, after all these days, my parents are missing me awfully, why don't I buy a few souvenirs for them? He spent his money, but he spent his money in such a way that he didn't have any money left. And in order to get the souvenirs back, he had to get on board another ship to be able to pay for the souvenirs and get back home. And as we know from archival sources, he never made it home on the second voyage. The ship was shipwrecked and he drowned. So all we have is correspondence from him to his parents indicating, well, now I'm here, I'm buying these souvenirs, I spent my money, but oh my god, I have to get on board a second ship to be able to get home. So it's a very dramatic kind of story, and it's difficult to estimate how many sailors will have a similar fate as Gerrit Bakker had, but it's quite likely that this quite often happened, actually.
So Joost, how long will this show that you have be playing here, and what time can the people come and see it?
The show, the Rich Cargo's Dutch Prosperity, will be in the Nederlands Scheepvaartmuseum until the 10th of May, so up to and including the 9th of May. And we are open 7 days a week. Occasionally we are closed on Monday, but then we are 6 days a week we are open. So people will have all the opportunity in the world, I think, to come and visit the museum, and we are very happy to welcome them here.
Well, thank you very much for telling us about this exhibit.
My pleasure.
The Scheepvaart Museum, in order to expand our understanding of the period and certainly to entertain us, has provided actors in the exhibit playing various roles from the mid-17th century. So now, let's find out who these characters are.
Merchant from the mid-17th century. My merchandise is grain, and my ships go to the Baltic Sea, to the Baltic states, to buy their grain and bring it to Amsterdam. There we keep it in our warehouses. From there I sell it to Italy, to Spain, and that means big money. The most important trade is the grain trade in that time. That's the base of the golden age. More than the spices trade to the East Indies. That's my character. I'm accompanied by my wife, Cornelia Anna Gijssen, geboren Kouwenhoven. And I give it over to her.
Thank you very much, dear. Yes. I'm Cornelia Anna Gijssen, as my husband said. I'm a merchant's wife, and, well, I might say I cannot complain. Huh? Well, my husband does all the work, but we have 2 houses, one in Amsterdam at the canal, and one near a river called the Vecht. I like lots of souvenirs, like Riga hout, which comes from, actually it comes from Russia, but we like to call it Riga hout because the merchandising is in Riga. And lots of other souvenirs I like very much. The ship, this man is the seaman.
I'm the skipper.
The skipper.
And of course, the lady said all these souvenirs that she loves, well, I'm the one who brings them to her. Yeah, and apart from them, of course, I'll bring the grain in. And, well, I'll make a few travels a year. And yeah, here on the exposition I let people see what for ships we use. And what did we go through those travels. I mean, we make good things, but we also make bad ones.
And in your character, what type of ship do you use?
A very typical Dutch ship, and that's the flute. Call it flute ship. Very known. It's for a very characteristic model. It's got a big belly, and the top deck, is very small, and that's quite important because we had to pay tax to the King of Denmark, and that tax was on the end of the deck, and small deck, lower tax, and that Dutch people are very good on that.
And when do you do this performance?
This performance, well, we do it during the weekend twice a day, at 1:30 and at 4 o'clock. And of course, days like today, we do it as two performances because it's holidays here for the children at school. So we do it at 1:30 and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But during the week, we do one performance, that's at 2:30 till the 1:30, and it's till the exposition goes till May 9th of May.
9th of May.
So still a few months.
Hello, this is David Heine, and today we're just outside of Amsterdam in the quaint village of Laren at the beautiful Singer Museum, and we're going to look at the Jan Sluijters exhibit and talk with Karen Verboeket. Karen, first let me ask you a little about the history of the Singer Museum itself.
Yeah, the Singer Museum was founded in 1956 by an American widow, the widow of the painter William Singer. They came to Europe during the turn of the century, and when they were in Paris, they decided Holland would be better as a very famous painter's country. And they came to Laren, and in a few years they decided to have a beautiful house built, and that was the beginning of the Singer Museum.
And how did it become a museum? I think it was later that it was bequeathed to the state, and what was that?
No, it's in the 50s. Singer had already died, and his widow decided she wanted to have a memorial foundation for the works her husband made, and also the collection they assembled. And she tried to get back the houses in Laren, but they were taken by the state after the Second World War, because all the refugees from the East Indies housed in there. But when it was declared free, she decided that the beautiful house in Laren would be the beginning of a museum and a concert hall. And in 56, the doors opened of the museum and the concert hall, and it's still a private foundation.
So you've recently you have a number of special exhibits here, and the one that's on right now is Jan Sluijters. Could you tell me a little about his history and his influences?
Yeah, the Singer Museum is very focused on painters of the modernist period, and especially those who worked and stayed in Laren and in the surroundings. And we decided to do a show on Jan Sluijters, and we show about 100 paintings from the very beginning of his career to really the end in the 50s. And what you see is about 7 rooms filled with bright colors and all the themes a painter should like to paint, especially a few portraits and beautiful female nudes. And they are about 50 years of Sluijters' activity is exhibited here in Laren. And it's beautiful to see that in the beginning of his career he experimented a lot in modernist styles. He began very traditional, as all painters do when they come from school. And he made a big journey to Rome and Spain, but later on he decided Paris would be better for him. So there he started with his experiments in Fauvism and Pointillism and whatever all styles were active over there. And then in the 20s, when he was already long way back in Holland, he painted in a realistic style. And you'll see all these experiments and beautiful paintings over here.
So Jan Sluijters was a young man in Paris who did he associate with while he was in Paris, and what were his influences?
Well, he stayed in Montmartre where all the other artists stayed, and he knew Van Dongen, for example, another Dutch painter who went to Paris and most of the time stayed in Paris, in France. And he learned a lot. He learned the modern way of living in the city, and he painted in bright colors, and he loved the electric light, which was new in Paris. And he went to the dancing halls, and he painted people dancing and going around. And he experimented in a new style, Fauvism, bright red and green spaces, and his paintings were very dynamic then.
And he came back to Amsterdam and kept that style long after maybe Paris had eclipsed and illuminated much of Holland. How long did he keep painting in this style?
Well, he changed all the time. We think that he painted in about 7 styles. And he painted for 50 years, because when he woke up in the morning at 9, he started painting up until 4 o'clock. And then he stopped, but every day, even if he wasn't inspired. So he was a real working man, and he made about, we think, 3,000 paintings. So we have only 100, but that's enough to see the career painters had. But he worked every day, and he painted in, we think 7 different styles. So he changed all the time, and when he thought his experiments were ready, he painted a masterpiece, and then he went on to a new style. And from the 20s on, he painted in a real realistic style, portraits and his own family life in the house.
There was a period, and it's reflected in the show, where his paintings turned very brown and somber. What was going on then?
Well, especially in the 30s, he went for a small a trip to Spain, and he was very inspired by Goya and Velázquez, and they paint very brown, but they were older painters, and he was inspired by them. But I think in the dark colors he's not on his best. His bright colors are better, but he tried everything. So he tried to paint Amsterdam in brown colors like Breitner did before, but his technique is totally different, and his technique is more adjusted to bright colors.
Now, Amsterdam at the turn of the century was not exactly Paris. There must have been a circle of friends that were part of Sluijters' group. Who was he associated with, and what museums collected him?
Well, when he came back from Paris, he influenced Mondrian and Gestel, 2 of the other Dutch painters who became very popular in modernist painting. And he didn't need the art dealers. Sluijters didn't need them. There was one collector named Mr. Esser, who collected works of art from Sluijters from 1907 until 1912, and he especially loved the early works. But later on, Sluijters became very known, and the Stedelijk Museum organized about 4 solo exhibitions on Sluijters. And when he died in 1957, he even was carried out of the Stedelijk Museum to his funeral. So he was popular very soon in his career.
Now, there was a period after he died in which he sort of was eclipsed and went away. But when I come to your exhibition here, I've never seen so many people. What do you attribute to his popularity today?
I think there are a few things. One of all is that the realistic way of painting is more popular these days. And Sluijters is the king of realistic painting. In his time he was. And people are very used to modernist paintings nowadays, so Sluijters is one of the best. And everybody knows works of Sluijters, not only his paintings, but he made book illustrations for children books. He was very known for his very sharp drawings of political statements during the First World War. So everybody knows something about Sluijters, and he only died in 1957. So I think a lot of people know him, but they didn't know he painted such a variety of styles. And also I think on the Singer Museum focused on modernist painters, and he's a very good example of them.
Speaking of different subjects, he seems to cover a wide range of subjects. What were his favorite subjects, and maybe you could describe them a little bit to us?
Well, I think Sluijters' favorite subject was nude, female nude. Maybe that's why all the public is so enthusiastic. It's really beautiful, and he liked to. Well, he preferred painting nude women to men, dressed men, because he said you could lay them down on a couch and you could use some clothing on them, and they are beautiful. And he paints them very beautiful. I think the exhibition shows a lot of nude women, but in a very optimistic, bright, brilliant way. You really tend to know the person who's painted there. It's not a model. It's what Sluijters thinks of that person, and that's what he puts into his paintings, into the paint. I think that's interesting about Sluijters. It's not just the outside of a person, but mostly the inside, actually, although she has nothing on.
Now, you told me once, in the latter part of his career, he became a portrait painter that was actually sought after by a number of people. And you told me a little story about a portrait or someone that had come to pose for him in Simon Street. Could you tell me that story again?
Yeah, there's a beautiful portrait of an astronomist. I think you call them like that. And it was a professor. And he wanted his portrait painted. And on the portrait, you see a constellation of stars. And we think, it's a decorative way of Sluijters painting the stars, but it really is a constellation that happens once in a lifetime, I think. And he must have gone with the professor to look through the telescope at that constellation, and you see the beautiful face of this very serious professor sitting there, and behind him, in a very blue-gray background, you see this beautiful constellation of stars. And he's also writing something down, and with if you look very carefully, you could see these are, mathematic formulas or something, and you can really read them. And painters, there's a beautiful story about Sluijters. Once he was walking with his son in Amsterdam, and a man came towards them, and the man said, "Hello, Mr. Sluijters," and he said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "Don't you recognize me? I was with you last week. I was your model, you painted me." He said, "Oh, but I didn't look." And that is exactly what Sluijters did. The model was there, he made a sketch, and when the model was gone, out of his memory, he put in the painting what he remembered of that particular person. And that's, I think, what people like in his paintings.
Now, he's also conveyed a number of paintings of Amsterdam and the Dutch landscape in his early years that were extraordinary, really. Could you describe those a little?
Yeah, when he came back from Paris, he went to Amsterdam. He was already married, and he had a little daughter, but he fell in love with another woman, and he rented a few rooms in a house in Laren, very nearby the Singer Museum. And he stayed over there during 1909 and 1911, and it was enough for him in his, I think, romantic way, feelings, I don't know, to paint from inside out, because he saw a beautiful moon landscape. He saw trees and a moon above, and that was enough for him. He painted a whole series of about 4 or 5 of these moon nights, and I think it's typical for Sluijters that he could stay inside the house to paint the panorama or paint his family or models who came inside his house. And in the early days he painted in a luministic way, bright colors and very optimistic, and blue and green and red. And the landscapes are really, well, they're not really romantic, they're really paintings, but you can actually still feel what he felt when he painted these landscapes. They're very nice.
My overall impression of the exhibit is that while it was painted over the last 100 years, it remains very modern. Would you call him still contemporary in some ways?
Well, I think he's contemporary in the way he uses his paint. It's fabulous. But it's funny you ask this, because before the First World War, he painted paintings that still after the Second World War were not allowed to be on an exhibition, especially the nudes. And I think that what we like now is that he stays brilliant in the way his career developed, and the very early ones even seem even more modern than the ones he painted in the 40s and 50s. And I know why this is, because when we look at them, we recognize the old-fashioned clothing, and we recognize the period between the two world wars. And the very early works of art of Sluijters are even brighter, and they look more modern than the later ones. Yeah, it's funny.
Now, I noticed in the exhibit there are oftentimes exotic portraits conveyed. Was this a tendency of Sluijters? Exotic people?
Yeah, because he said people can be beautiful, but it's for a painter it's interesting to have models that are interesting. So what he looked for, and he was the one who started it, I think. Already in 1914, he painted a beautiful series of Negro portraits. People he met in wrestling games and boxing games, because it was a sport he liked. He was a big man and very strong. And he met dark people over there, and also dark women, or say mixed women, a dark blood and white blood mixed. And you see that there's a beautiful portrait of one woman who wants to be very European, has her face like whitened, but you see she's a dark woman, and she has a beautiful hat on and a very European long necklace, and she's very mundane, but also she stays a black woman, and that's so beautiful. And he was very interested in interesting types. So gypsies, when gypsies came to his door, they asked for money, and he said, "No, I know something better. You come up into my studio, you pose, and I'll pay you money for that." Because these people had interesting features, and that's what he liked to paint.
It seems throughout his career he also maintained certain motifs and backgrounds, both interesting, the flowers and the backgrounds seemingly developed in different ways.
Yeah, that's true. When you walk through the exhibition and you take your time, you'll recognize some elements on all the paintings. Say, for instance, a blue vase, a blue and white china vase, or a white pots and pans, a lamp, oriental rugs. And he liked to collect rugs and tapestries from oriental styles. And you see them coming back in the different paintings through years.
And so, at the Singer, how many people do you expect this year to come to this exhibit?
To this exhibit alone, I don't know, but I think every day we have more than 1,000 visitors, and on Sundays I think 2,000, and the exhibition goes on until the 25th of April, so there will be a lot of people, but I see everybody likes the exhibition, and that's something we are very that's something that's very special for us, to make exhibitions people like, and to explain a bit why who was Jan Sluijters and what was his career. And I think it's in 100 paintings you see everything.
Well, Karen, thank you very much for talking with us today. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Hello, today we're at the Rembrandt house, where there's a new exhibit of Goethe and Rembrandt. With us today is the curator of that exhibit and author of the book on Goethe and Faust, Bob van den Boogaard. Bob, the coupling of Rembrandt and Goethe, two men who lived in different countries and lived in different centuries, what's the relationship here?
Well, Goethe was a great admirer of Dutch art from the 17th century. He also was a great admirer of Italian Renaissance art and of classical art, and that's where he's most famous for. But he also was a great admirer of Dutch art, and that's the main issue of the show that that's on here. And we're trying to show some objects, mainly drawings that Goethe collected, drawings by Dutch artists from the 17th century, from the Golden Age, and drawings that he collected for his patron. He was in the service of a Duke of Weimar, and also for this Duke he collected a lot of drawings. And we're also giving an impression of this collection of Dutch drawings in the show here.
Bob, I've noticed as I looked at the exhibit that we think of Goethe as a writer and a statesman and a traveler of the world at that time, but he was something of an artist too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a draftsman himself. He has made a lot of very nicely done drawings himself. And the nice thing about these drawings, of which some are exhibited in the show, is that these drawings are inspired by the drawings he collected by these Dutch artists. The composition, the subject matter is inspired on these drawings that he possessed and collected, and that's very interesting, because in his early drawings you see this strong influence of these Dutch drawings, and then Goethe travels to Italy in 1768. Yeah. 86, excuse me, 1786, and then you see this the influence of Italian art and classical art increasing, and his drawings that he made after this travel to Italy are clearly influenced by Italian art, and that's also in the show. It's made visual. By way of two drawings. You see one drawing in which he copies an etching by Rembrandt, and then you see the way he transforms this image into an Italian classicist landscape, and that's very interesting because it's representative of the change his artistical. Taste is changing in these years, and you see this illustrated by these two drawings by Goethe, which are in the show.
Now, when I was a boy, I mean, what I know Goethe mostly by is Faust, his very famous work. In fact, the Penguin edition that I read had Rembrandt's etching on the front. What is that relationship, please?
Well, Goethe, of course, knew this etching, this Faust etching by Rembrandt, which, by the way, was only first called Faust in the 18th century. In the 17th century, there are no sources that mention this print being a representation of Faust. We now think it represents Saint Paul, but well, you can. There are a lot of opinions on differing opinions on this, but Goethe thought it was a Faust representation, and when he wrote his Faust, the first version of his Faust, he was strongly influenced by Rembrandt's works of art. He studied his prints. And the first edition of some fragments of the Faust have a print as a frontispiece in it, which is exactly copied after the Rembrandt's print. So when you combine these things, you can imagine that Goethe, when he wrote the first version of his Faust, had this picture, this image of Rembrandt's Faust in the back of his mind. So it is partly inspired on Rembrandt's Faust etching.
I noticed also that when I was looking at the prints, most of them come from the Weimar, from a collection there. How did so many great Dutch masters of the 17th century end up in the Weimar?
Well, Goethe was a collector himself. He tried to form a collection of works of art that would give a complete overview of the history of art, and because he was a great admirer of the works of the Dutch masters, he collected a lot of drawings by these artists, and also for this Duke, for which he was in the service of which he was at that moment in Weimar. And he had a lot of art dealers were sending him as a connoisseur a lot of drawings on view. And when he liked some of them, he picked them out of this. He picked them out and put them in his collection, or in the collection of this Duke. And well, you could still afford drawings in the 18th century when you were an ordinary Duke or an ordinary author. But a lot of paintings from this period and from Holland were too expensive to be bought by the Duke or by Goethe himself. So.
Now, I've noticed you've also included a series of those Dutch painters and artists that were Goethe's favorites. Maybe you could tell us a few of those and what the subjects are.
Well, there are some drawings by Rembrandt in the show, which were owned by Goethe himself. You can see this by way of the little stamp with the name of Goethe on the drawings. He must have been very proud of these drawings because he stamped them with his name. Some of these drawings were Rembrandt's when Goethe bought them, but now we know that they were were done by one of his pupils. For instance, there's a drawing representing Christ blessing the children, which was definitely thought of by Goethe as a Rembrandt. He bought it as a Rembrandt, and now we know it's by Samuel van Hoogstraten, one of Rembrandt's pupils. And there are some more drawings that of which the attribution has changed in the past century. So that's the progress of our knowledge in this matter.
Now, I'd like to divert a little bit from the subject of this new show and ask you a couple of questions. I've noticed over the last year that your building next door, the Rembrandt house itself, has been under renovation, and there are still plywood windows there. How's that going?
Well, that's going very, very well. At the end of this year, we're planning to reopen the building, and then the interior of the building will be reconstructed in 17th century style, in the style in which it was when Rembrandt lived there in the Rembrandt house. Everyone knows the Rembrandt house as the Rembrandt the house where Rembrandt lived. But the interior was a 19th century interior, basically, and we have removed this 19th century interior and are replacing it now at the moment by 17th century furniture, 17th century staircase, 17th century mantelpieces, etc. And the atmosphere will be exactly like it was when Rembrandt lived there he has lived here for 20 years and made some of his most famous paintings here in the old building next door. And well, when the reconstruction will be finished at the end of this year, people will get a true impression of the way Rembrandt lived when he worked and lived here in Amsterdam. So.
Now, if the people want to come and see this exhibit, and I think they should want to come and see this exhibit, what are your hours and when can they come?
They can come each day. The hours are 10 to 5 and well, everyone knows where to find the Rembrandt House in the Jodenbreestraat in Amsterdam, near the Waterlooplein, the flea market. So.
Well, very good. Thank you very much, Bob, for telling us about the show.